What's up, guys? So I'm super excited. Today we're doing a well draining soil video. I have been asked a bunch of times about soil, what's best, where can I get it, what's the cheapest. So I'm super excited to touch on all of that in this video. Okay, with the soil, I keep a few things in mind. Accessibility for one, the price, and I would say maybe effort. I think those are like my main things when I am doing my soil mix. Accessibility, I like to just go to the store and buy everything that I need, whether it's local or a locally owned or like a big box store. I'd rather do that than order materials online and have them shipped to me. I just kind of don't want to wait. Price, I'm not cheap, super cheap, but I do want to spend closer to as little as I can still, while still having a quality mix. So I will say it's kind of like I'm on a budget a little bit. And then effort, I don't want to do a crazy amount of effort. I like to keep it very simple. I think in the long run, simplicity when it comes to plant care is going to ensure that you're going to actually stick with this hobby and you're going to have more fun. You're not going to stress over it. I have enough things I can stress over and worry about in my life, and I do not want my plants to be one of them. Something I want to say before I get into this is I use a mix that is very basic, for lack of better words. I can get away with using this mix for practically all my plants. I might alter it a little bit, but I keep the same materials for that mix. And if you have any plants that require very specific mediums or environments in general, then this mix may not be for you. You might have to add a little bit more or sub some stuff out. I do not really have any plants like that, so I don't really need to worry about it, but that is just something to keep in mind. Now let's get into the actual mix. Now the actual materials, ignore my dirty carpet. Peat moss is the most important part. You can sub this for a few different things, but this is going to make up the majority of the medium. If you cannot just find plain peat moss, or you just don't want to buy plain peat moss for some reason, you can totally sub that out. I would recommend a cacti succulent mix that already has some added materials to help it be more well draining, so that's even better. Maybe stay away from like a Miracle-Gro mix or something. A lot of those usually have a ton of fertilizer added, and too much fertilizer is not always good for your plants. I will say, if you go somewhere and you do have options, the peat moss is usually the cheapest way to go, and you can buy it in bulk. I can get like a big, I think it's like a few cubic meters, I can't remember, but it is a lot cheaper than buying the bags of like just cacti succulent mix or whatever else. And you can almost always find this at your local Home Depot, Lowe's, or even like Ace will probably have it. And if you don't want to go that route, at big box stores, local nurseries almost always carry peat moss, so you can also do that if you want to kind of support small businesses. Perlite being the second biggest item, and perlite is just as important as the peat moss in my opinion. If you cannot find perlite, which is every once in a while, I can't find it for some reason, but it's very rare. Perlite is usually very easy to find. Vermiculite can also be subbed, or if you just prefer vermiculite, you can use that instead. Both are relatively cheap, and again, if you can find the giant bags, you will save money buying that. I have a huge bag in my garage of perlite, and it's lasted me forever. And again, perlite or vermiculite, whatever you decide to use, almost always is available at your local big box store, but again, if you can't find it there, local nurseries almost always carry it. And then sand is the third item that I use. Will say, if you are trying to do the least amount of work possible with the least amount of effort, you could just take out the sand and not use it and just do perlite and peat moss. I will say I like the sand. It adds a little bit more like retention for moisture in my mix, and I know that might sound contradicting because you want a well draining soil, but if your soil is overly well draining and it's not retaining any moisture, that's just more work for you, because that means more watering, and that just means the plant isn't actually being thoroughly watered, so it's just always going to be thirsty and in that state, and that's not good either. So for my sand, I just use a fine natural playground sand that you can grab from Home Depot or Lowe's. And when I say fine, it is not a coarse sand. So if you were buying like a, what is it called? Oh, I'm blanking. It's a sand that is specifically used for plants, for like potting up and mixing with your medium. Because of how coarse that sand is, it's going to make your soil even more well draining. Now this sand, because it is so fine, it'll help a little bit, but it's mostly just there to help keep your soil a little bit more compact, to help it absorb a little bit more moisture than it would without it. Okay, now we're actually going to move on to mixing our medium. All right, so we have all of our materials set out, our peat moss, perlite, and sand, and then our bowl to mix. I normally use a giant bucket, but for now I'm just going to use this little bowl. So I do not use percentages or anything like that when I am measuring out my ingredients. I keep it pretty simple. I used to follow a 3-2-1, and that is very common and well known. That would be 3 parts of your 3 parts of your peat moss or cacti mix, whatever you use for the base of your medium. 2 parts perlite or vermiculite, and then 1 part sand. That worked great with my cacti and succulents, but I found that with the majority of my houseplants, I needed something a little bit more well draining, so I kind of altered it a little bit. You can use whatever you want to measure. I don't use anything fancy. I use a cup, literally whatever I have on hand. So we're gonna start with our base. This is the 1 part of the peat moss, and I do equal parts perlite. This bowl is not big enough. And about like half a part of sand, maybe a little less. Again, I just kind of eyeball it. This bowl is so not big enough. Now that we have it mixed, you can see it is pretty heavy on the perlite, which is totally fine. Honestly, sometimes I will add about half a cup more of peat moss or the cacti mix, whatever you're using for your main base. It just kind of depends on what I'm using it for, if I want a little bit more soil in it or not, but this is totally fine. And again, if you feel that you need a little bit more peat moss in it, add a little more peat moss. If you put too much and you need some more perlite, add perlite. The sand, you could always add a little bit more, but I will say the item that you should be using the least amount in this mix is the sand. So yeah, that's it. I mean, I use this mix for all of my plants. Like I said, I adjusted it a little bit. It's cheap, it's accessible, it's easy, and I think that's really important. Okay, last thing, I swear, but there's always gonna be a million things you can add to your soil. You could do bark, worm castings, I can go on and on. And yes, some plants, most plants will benefit from all of those added materials, but you do not really need all those all the time, especially if you have very easygoing plants. Like, you just don't need it. So just make sure you're doing a little bit of research before. If you have a very high maintenance plant that needs very specific requirements, you might need to add some orchid bark maybe to your mix to make it very chunky. So just keep that in mind. Okay, that's it. I wanted to keep it very simple because the mix itself is very simple. I think this is a great mix for those maybe just starting out in planting and they don't know where to start, or those that just don't want to buy a pre-mixed bag, because honestly you can do better. If you do buy a pre-mixed bag, one last thing I'll say, if you just want to buy cacti succulent mix, maybe buy an additional bag of perlite and just add a little bit in there, because sometimes it's still not well draining enough for plants that really need it. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helped, especially those that requested it. I hope you guys have a good one, and I will see you in my next video.